As the saying goes, good friends make for better enemies. But sometimes in wrestling, the opposite of that can be true. Hell, sometimes those who have been the biggest enemies make for the best partners before all is said and done, because they know each other so well. But what are the biggest examples of former rivals becoming teammates in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with one of the most iconic examples of all time, and that's the Rock and Sock connection. Yes, back in 1998 and early 1999, The Rock and Mankind had one of the best feuds going in WWF. And what made it particularly exciting wasn't just that they were two relative newcomers to the main event scene in the WWF, making the whole thing feel fresher than what was taking place over in WCW at the same time, but there was also an undeniable chemistry between the pair. So perhaps it's no surprise then that following some absolutely brutal encounters, including their savage I Quit match at the 1999 Royal Rumble, which was a step too far for even many bloodthirsty Attitude Era fans, Dwayne Johnson and Mick Foley realized they were better off pooling their resources together and teaming up rather than trying to kill each other in the ring anymore. Basically, it all started on the August 30th, 1999 episode of Raw when, after challenging then tag team champions The Undertaker and The Big Show to a match, the Great One was forced to try and find a partner on short notice. And when the only person he could find who wanted any part of the Unholy Alliance that evening was his former rival, magic took place. That's right, not only did the Rock and Sock Connection win the tag team titles here, but even after they'd lost them again a couple of weeks later, they'd continue to team up together. Sure, it took the People's Champion a while to warm up to the idea, as in his head he was far too cool for Mrs. Foley's baby boy. But in the end, even he failed to mix unique charms, and so it was that a permanent union was forged. A union which eventually gave us classic moments such as The Rock's This Is Your Life segment, as well as two further runs with the tag team titles. And so beloved did they become because of these moments, even as far as the 2010s, they were still inspiring others to form their own pairings like Sasha Banks and Bayley's Boss and Hug connection. Of course, they're not the only odd couple tag team that have captured the hearts of fans though, as in 2012, the same thing happened when Team Hell No formed. What was this one? Well, it was the union of Daniel Bryan and Kane, two performers who, on the face of things, couldn't have seemed further apart in both style and personality. After all, Glenn Jacobs is a 7-foot-tall, real-life politician known for destroying his opponents with power moves in the ring, and the American Dragon is a 5'10" hippie from Washington who prides himself on being a technical wrestling maestro. But it was that very clashing of worlds which made things work so well when they were brought together, as seeing the two have to coexist gave us some excellent comedy moments to keep us watching in the otherwise deadlands that were the early 2010s WWE. Seriously, witnessing Daniel Bryan, a man who had always been vocal about not being a hugger, being forced to hug it out with the Big Red Machine as their on-screen therapist Dr. Shelby cheered them on was certainly a sight to see. And it was all made even better when you consider the fact that, before Team Hell No became a thing, the two were actually in-ring rivals, so much so that they met multiple times in the ring earlier that year as part of a feud which also involved CM Punk and AJ Lee. But once they were an official team, any memories they had of hating one another quickly dissipated as they found their groove, so much so that by September 16th's Night of Champions pay-per-view, they'd have beaten Kofi Kingston and R-Truth to become WWE Tag Team Champions. Hell, so over did they become that it ultimately helped to convince Vince McMahon to at least give the future Blackpool Combat Club member a chance in the main event scene in the summer of the following year. But what happens if your unlikely tag team made up of former rivals already had two main eventers in it? Well, we can find out the answer right now, as we have a perfect example of this in 2001's brief union of Stone Cold Steve Austin and Triple H, the two-man power trip. And let's make no mistake about it, with The Rock leaving to go film a movie at this point in time, Austin and The Game were without question the two biggest stars WWF had at the time. It would be like if Roman Reigns and Cody Rhodes decided to partner up today and take over both Raw and SmackDown. Of course, seeing the Rattlesnake get together with someone like H was certainly a surprise for fans at the time, as only a few weeks prior, the pair had been involved in a heated blood feud. In fact, in November of 2000, it had been revealed that Triple H was the one who masterminded Rikishi's attempts to end Stone Cold's career by running him over with a car. Obviously then, this had led to some intense bouts, with their 3 Stages of Hell match at February 25th, 2001's No Way Out being a particularly brutal affair. So why did they decide to form a bond only a month after this? Well, the truth is they weren't supposed to originally. No, it was originally supposed to be a babyface cerebral assassin going after a heel rattlesnake. But being a master politician, the game realized that if he teamed up with Austin rather than fight him, it would keep him in the main event spot for longer, and so that's why he lobbied Vince McMahon to change things up. Sure, they were going to come to blows and feud eventually, but this would draw things out and make the Intercontinental Champion more relevant in the long run, as far as he saw it. Unfortunately, though, things never managed to get to their final act with this one, as before they could, H would be put on the shelf when he tore his quad muscle off the bone during a tag team bout, pitting him and his partner against Chris Benoit and Chris Jericho on the May 21st, 2001 episode of Raw. But even if this one was aborted before its time, there at least were other unlikely unions during the Attitude Era which did manage to get a satisfying conclusion, such as the time Chris Jericho and Chyna found themselves partnering up. But wait, why were Y2J and the Ninth Wonder of the World aligned in 1999 WWF? After all, it wasn't like they had much in common. Well, while this was true, they did have one shared goal, and that goal was to become the Intercontinental Champion. That said, while many might imagine that it was Jericho who achieved this goal first, it was actually Chyna who did instead. And the reason for that was because she was so catastrophically over at the turn of the millennium, it makes current-day Rhea Ripley look like a jobber by comparison. Yes, it was at October 17th, 1999's No Mercy pay-per-view that Joanie Laurer beat Jeff Jarrett to become the first woman in WWE history to ever hold a men's title. Of course, now that she was the champion though, she'd have to fend off challengers on all fronts, and none of these challengers gave her more trouble than the Ayatollah of Rock and Rolla. But while their early days on screen together would be defined by their heated feud, it wasn't long before the two were forced to team up together, as on the December 28th episode of SmackDown that year, they'd pin each other at the same time during an Intercontinental title bout, and as a result, be crowned co-champions. So this meant that whenever the belt was defended going forward then, they'd each have a stake in their side coming out the winner, with this forcing them to get on the same page quickly, even if they had no time for one another in either kayfabe or real life. That's right, it appears a little bit of reality bled into the fiction here, as according to Jericho in a later interview, he and Chyna truly didn't get along that well behind the scenes, but were forced to work together for the purposes of the storyline. Just as well, they were both professionals then, because whenever the camera was on, they did their jobs perfectly. So perfectly that when Y2J eventually won a triple threat match between him, his partner, and Hardcore Holly at the 2000 Royal Rumble to become the undisputed champion, fans were sad to see the storyline end. But at least they could turn over to other channels if they still wanted their fix of an enemies turned friends angle at this point, as over in ECW, they were putting out one of the best versions of this storyline ever in the years-long saga that was the Ballad of Tommy Dreamer and Raven. Seriously, when people talk about the best feuds of the second boom period, they often talk about things like Austin versus McMahon or Hogan versus Sting. But right up there alongside them in terms of quality is Paul Heyman's masterpiece, Tommy Dreamer versus Raven. And the reason this one was so good was because it flipped expectations, with the jock who bullied the outcast at school being the hero in the situation and the victim of his bullying being the sadistic heel. Sure, it helped that Tommy Dreamer was such a likable guy so few wanted to boo him, but even then, pulling off something like that for the late 90s audience was quite an achievement. Of course, what some have forgotten now is that following the Innovator of Violence's 2-year odyssey to finally pin his rival in a singles bout, the pair were actually forced to coexist and team up at one point, something which neither of them seemed happy about, but which they went along with anyway as it served a greater purpose. What was that greater purpose? Well, it was getting the ECW tag team titles off the Dudley Boys before they left for the WWF and took the gold with them. So that was how, on the September 18th, 1999 episode of Hardcore TV, the two bitter rivals put their differences aside for long enough to beat Bubba Ray and Devon, and in the process, keep the belts in the company they belonged in. Sure, this partnership wouldn't last for long, as the wounds between the pair were too deep for it to be anything lengthy, but that didn't matter, as their job had been completed at this point, and so they could go their own separate ways from there, with Raven also eventually joining the WWF before the end of the Attitude Era. But let's get away from that time period for now, and instead move on to something a bit closer to the modern day. And that's the time two of WWE's best mid-card talents were forced to start teaming up after a hugely underrated feud between them took place in 2016. That's right, it's time to talk about The Bar. Who were The Bar? Well, they were Cesaro, one of the most underrated performers of his generation, and Sheamus, a former 4-time world champion who somehow still doesn't get the credit he deserved for being a wrestler so intense and powerful he could easily step inside of a New Japan Pro Wrestling ring. Needless to say then, when the pair began a program together in July of that year, it was a hard-hitting affair that would have made Antonio Inoki proud. And what made it all the better was that fans knew ahead of time they were guaranteed to get multiple bouts, as this one would be a best-of-7 series, with the winner receiving a future title shot. That said, when the final match ended in a draw, leaving the overall score tied, it meant that title shot would instead come in the form of a match for the tag team straps, with this forcing the two to start teaming up together. But while this could have been a disaster, it ended up being the best thing for both men. As they had such good chemistry together, they quickly became a standout of the division. So good were they, in fact, that over the course of their run together, they'd win not only the Raw Tag Team titles on 4 separate occasions, but also the SmackDown Tag Team titles on 1 occasion. So as far as makeshift unions of former rivals go, the Bar has to rank right up there alongside the best of them, as it breathed new life into the careers of both the Swiss Superman and the Dublin-born Brawler right when they needed it the most. And the exact same thing could be said about our next 2 subjects as well, as it happens, because when Bray Wyatt and Matt Hardy began teaming up in 2018, it gave each man another lease on life too. Sure, Bray in particular shouldn't have needed this back then, but with WWE's creative team being what it was, it perhaps shouldn't come as a surprise that he did. And well, we love Matt Hardy and everything, but come the mid-2010s, he was starting to reach the elder statesman period of his career, where his role was mostly to get other younger stars over. And that was why he was at first tasked with entering into a feud with Bray in November of 2017. A feud which would see him somewhat revive his broken gimmick for a WWE audience with the woken Matt Hardy character. Of course, this led to a cinematic bout between the pair then, one named the Ultimate Deletion. And once that was over and the two had gotten their hatred for one another out of their systems, they decided to give tagging together a shot starting at WrestleMania 34 in April of 2018. How would this go for the team who'd soon come to be known as the Deleters of Worlds? Pretty well, as it happened, because at April 27th's Greatest Royal Rumble show in Saudi Arabia, they'd win the then-vacant Raw Tag Team titles after defeating the Bar for the honor. Sure, they would lose them to the B Team soon after this, but that shouldn't take away from the fact that they were able to stay on the same page for long enough to gain some gold in the first place. And had they stayed together for much longer, they might have even regained the titles, as they were turning out to be quite an effective duo when push came to shove. Unfortunately though, an injury picked up by Matt Hardy soon thereafter would force the pair to disband before they could reach their true potential, with the broken one eventually going on to join AEW after this, all while Wyatt took some time off to rethink his character, something which would eventually lead to him returning the following year as the horror movie villain, The Fiend. But this wasn't the only time Matt Hardy was involved in an odd couple tag team made out of 2 prior enemies, as it happened, because years earlier, back in the Ruthless Aggression era SmackDown, he'd done the same thing. When he did it then, though, it wasn't a spooky character like Bray Wyatt he'd find himself teaming with. No, instead, it was MVP. Yes, if you were watching the Blue Brand during this period, then you might remember the highly entertaining mid-card feud that was Hardy versus MVP in 2007, where the two repeatedly battled it out over the United States title. But while this program was great and gave us such comedic highlights as them taking part in arm wrestling contests, drinking competitions, chess matches, and even a boxing fight which saw the heel get knocked out by former WBA, WBC, and IBF heavyweight champion Evander Holyfield, it really reached another level altogether when the two were forced to start teaming up soon thereafter. Why were they teaming up at all, though? Well, like with so many other pairings we've discussed today, it was the promise of Tag Team Gold that brought them together. That's right, after an opportunity to win the WWE Tag Team titles became available on the August 31st episode of SmackDown that year, MVP and Matt Hardy decided to put their differences aside and go after the gold, which was then being held by Deuce and Domino. And as it happened, the unlikely duo would be able to win this one, meaning that from then on in, they'd be known as tag team champions, even if they still didn't like one another in kayfabe. That said, this dislike didn't stop them from acting like a well-oiled machine when it came time to defend those belts, as over the next few months, they'd take on all comers and beat them, with them only losing the gold on November 16th of that same year, after an injury Hardy was still recovering from left him easy pickings for The Miz and John Morrison to score a victory over him. What would happen to the now former tag team champions after that? They'd go right back to being at each other's throats, of course. And this would be the same fate which awaited our next 2 subjects once they split in 2008 as it happened. Who are we talking about here? Why, Cody Rhodes and Hardcore Holly, of course. Yes, the American Nightmare has been on quite a journey over the last decade and a half, with him going from member of the Legacy to Stardust, to founding member of AEW, and then to main event force in WWE. Before any of that happened, however, he was a rookie looking to establish himself, and the way he set about doing this in 2007 was by going after an old veteran in Hardcore Holly. That said, despite challenging Holly on multiple occasions throughout the summer of that year following his main roster debut with the New York promotion, Rhodes' inexperience constantly came back to bite him, as no matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't pick up that elusive victory. Rather, he'd lose to his rival on no less than 3 occasions, with this forcing him to reassess where he was going at that point. And after taking a moment to think things over then, he decided the best way to reach the next level would be to sit under the learning tree of the Alabama native rather than fight him. And so this is what led to the two forming a tag team in December. But this was no go-nowhere pairing like so many others of that time period were. No, this one would see Cody and Holly become World Tag Team Champions after defeating Lance Cade and Trevor Murdoch on the 15th anniversary special of Raw. And now that they were champions, it felt like the world was their oyster, with them at this point vowing to hold on to the gold for the foreseeable future. But while such a statement would prove to be true for Cody, it wouldn't be true for his partner, because in June of 2008, the rookie turned on the veteran and instead aligned himself with Ted DiBiase Jr., with those two winning the World Tag Team titles in what was effectively a handicap bout against Holly at that month's Night of Champions pay-per-view. And so, like that, the saga of Cody Rhodes and Hardcore Holly came to an end, with one running out the clock on his contract and the other going on to far greater things. Is Holly still bitter about this? Probably not, as he seems to be happy in retirement at this point in his life. And as for Cody, we're not sure he even thinks about such an early portion of his career at all anymore, considering the other things he'd currently got on his mind, like finishing the story. So let's move away from them for now and instead venture over to the WWE Women's Division, the place our next duo of rivals turned partners reside. Who are we talking about this time? Why, who else but Shayna Baszler and Nia Jax. That's right, before they became 2-time women's tag team champions together, the former UFC fighter and the walking injury zone were actually bitter rivals. And the reason they were at each other's throats so much was because each of them were desperate to be the one to take the Raw Women's title from Becky Lynch. Unfortunately for them, though, neither was able to achieve this goal in the end. No, that honor would instead go to pregnancy, as it was this which forced the man to vacate. So in lieu of being able to dethrone the top dog in the division, Baszler and Jax decided to put their differences aside and go after some different gold in the tag team division. Ah yes, the illustrious WWE Women's Tag Team titles, perhaps the worst booked belts in modern memory. Still, with each of the challengers having a chip on their shoulder, they felt compelled to prove the division could be much more. And so that was why they headed into their title bout against the Boss and Hug Connection at August 30th, 2020's Payback, intent on destroying the champs and firmly establishing themselves as the new queens of the division. Would they do this? Yes, as it happened. And even if they would drop them to Asuka and Charlotte Flair a few months later at December's TLC Tables, Ladders, and Chairs pay-per-view, they'd win them back again before long, when in January of 2021, they pinned the Queen and the Empress of Tomorrow to start their second run on top. Sadly though, that would mark the high point of their time together, as when they lost their gold again a few months after this, they'd split up for good when Jax turned on her partner. But at least during their brief time together, they got to prove that bitter enemies can make for great friends if the situation is right, something the rest of the examples we've looked at today have also proven.